Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The Consensus Question. Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope is frequently reduced to a mythic struggle of archetypal good against an irredeemable, faceless evil. This consensus characterizes the film as a high-adventure fairy tale, viewing the conflict through the lens of a clear-cut moral binary. However, this reading obscures the film's status as a profound meditation on the erosion of individual autonomy within an environment defined by extreme technological determinism. The film is not a simple morality play, it is a clinical examination of how bureaucratic machinery and state-sanctioned propaganda effectively strip citizens of their history, agency, and sense of self. The world of A New Hope is one of profound scarcity and systemic decay, where the fundamental currency is not gold or credits, but access to information. The Galactic Empire functions as an absolute monopoly, exerting control not merely through military might, but by strictly regulating the flow of history and data. Tatooine represents the baseline of this reality, a peripheral, desert landscape defined by the absence of the center. Luke Skywalker's existence here is one of total confinement, where his labor is harnessed by the agricultural needs of a harsh environment. His life is characterized by the repetition of mundane, mechanical tasks that emphasize his status as an object of the state, a cog in a machine that neither recognizes nor values his humanity. This systemic control is visually reinforced by the film's architectural hierarchy. The Empire's environments, most notably the Death Star, are cold, sterile, and hypergeometric. These spaces are frictionless, designed for the rapid movement of personnel and the efficient execution of imperial will. By contrast, the environments of the periphery, the crowded cantinas and subterranean dwellings, are cluttered with rusted, scavenged technology. This disparity reveals the Empire's gatekeeping of high-tier technology as a tool for subjugation. The characters who inhabit the fringes are forced to survive on the discarded, obsolete debris of the core. Their reality is dictated by the limitations of their hardware, trapping them in a cycle of maintenance and survival that prevents any meaningful resistance to the central authority. At the center of this structural oppression is the epistemic fracture that defines the protagonist's journey. Luke's initial understanding of his place in the universe is a fabricated narrative, the story of simple farm life that ignores his lineage and his potential. His transition from an unwitting laborer to an active participant in the rebellion is not merely a call to adventure, it is the forced confrontation with a reality that his society has aggressively obscured. When Luke finally discovers the truth of his identity and the history of the Jedi, he experiences a violent rupture of his previous ego. The film treats this not as a celebratory moment of self-actualization, but as a traumatic initiation into a world of heavy responsibility and existential weight. The Empire itself is an embodiment of the Jungian shadow, serving as the logical, if horrific, extension of a society that prioritizes efficiency over human value. Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin represent the absolute subsumption of the individual into the state apparatus. They function with a machine-like precision, their worldview predicated on the total erasure of dissent. Their logic is internally consistent and undeniably effective, which makes the resistance of the protagonists, frail, vulnerable, and deeply human, all the more significant. The rebellion is not a well-willed machine, it is a desperate, messy, and fragile network of individuals attempting to reclaim their agency from an entity that has effectively erased the very concepts of justice and mercy. The visual and technical craft of the film serves to emphasize this struggle. The cinematography utilizes wide shots to render the individual insignificant against the sprawling, intimidating geometry of imperial architecture. Conversely, the use of practical, lived-in textures for the rebel equipment and locales serves as a sensory reminder of human fallibility and resilience. The sound design, particularly the oppressive hum of imperial machinery, acts as an auditory manifestation of the state's presence, creating a sonic environment that is claustrophobic and relentless. Even in the film's climax, where Luke strikes the final blow, the victory is earned through his intuition, a rejection of the automated targeting systems that symbolize imperial dependency, thereby asserting the supremacy of the individual will over the cold, calculated efficiency of the machine. A New Hope concludes not with the total collapse of the system, but with a momentary disruption of its order. The legacy of the film lies in this recognition: the struggle for autonomy is an ongoing process of construction, not a final, static achievement. By rejecting the comforts of a simple moral binary, the film compels the viewer to acknowledge the fragility of their own reality and the necessity of individual agency in the face of overwhelming, institutionalized control. The hero's journey here is, above all, the recognition that history is not a pre-written script, but a constant, active engagement with a world that seeks to define the individual before they have a chance to define themselves. The subversion question. Star Wars, Episode 4 A New Hope is frequently framed as a quintessential hero's journey, a mythic template of light overcoming darkness through the pure-hearted agency of a farm boy. This consensus reading, however, functions as a narrative pacifier, obscuring the film's status as a harrowing study of systemic inertia and the predatory nature of technological supremacy. The film is not a story about the triumph of individual goodness, it is an examination of how totalizing structures, whether the Galactic Empire or the nebulous Force, inevitably commodify and neutralize the human subject. The structural tell lies in the film's obsession with waste, salvage, and the recursive nature of its own hardware. Luke Skywalker is not a hero rising to meet a destiny, he is a displaced laborer in a dying ecosystem, finally conscripted into a war that renders his humanity secondary to the functionality of his weaponry. The economics of the galaxy are defined by scarcity and the persistent rot of a post-industrial landscape. While the Empire represents the peak of centralized, sterile authority, the rest of the galaxy lives in the rusting debris of that power's previous iterations. The opening sequences on Tatooine establish this baseline. The primary labor of the society is the scavenging of high-tier technology that has been discarded by the state. This is a world where intellect and history have been reduced to scrap metal. Characters do not build, they retrieve. This pervasive state of decay creates an environment where human beings are physically and psychologically dwarfed by the massive, impersonal machinery of their reality. The cinematography reflects this through constant framing that isolates the protagonists against vast, indifferent horizons or within the claustrophobic corridors of hulking starships, signaling that in this universe, the individual is always an anomaly, a brief, burning spark in a cold, entropic vacuum. The psychological dimension of the film reveals a profound fracture in the protagonist's epistemic reality. Luke Skywalker's journey is not one of maturation, but of indoctrination. When he leaves the moisture farm, he is trading one set of constraints for another. The trauma of his upbringing, the death of his aunt and uncle, functions as the necessary catalyst to strip him of his previous social bonds, effectively erasing his personhood. He is immediately recontextualized as a vessel for the Force, a metaphysical system that, much like the Empire, requires the total surrender of the self. This aligns perfectly with the film's central philosophical tension. The conflict is not between freedom and tyranny, but between two competing modes of determinism. The Empire seeks order through mechanical control, while the rebellion seeks it through a religious, intangible obedience. In both instances, the human element is merely a component to be optimized or sacrificed. The aesthetic of the film reinforces this theme of the synthetic overtaking the organic. The production design, with its used universe aesthetic, hides the reality that even the rebellion's human touch is defined by the hardware they operate. The iconic X-Wings and lightsabers are not mere tools, they are the extensions of the character's will, effectively merging human impulse with destructive technology. The uncanny nature of the Force, which mediates nearly every meaningful action in the climax, replaces human ethical deliberation with a form of sensory intuition that bypasses the rational mind. When Luke turns off his targeting computer, he is not acting as an individual hero, he is becoming an instrument of a deterministic, external logic. The consensus reading applauds this as a moment of enlightenment, but the visual language suggests a terrifying erasure. The protagonist ceases to be a man and becomes a conduit, a weapon of high-velocity precision that completes the cycle of violence the system demands. Ultimately, the film leaves us in a state of unresolved structural preservation. The destruction of the Death Star does not dismantle the architecture of the Empire, nor does it liberate the laboring classes from the cycles of scavenging and scarcity. Instead, it serves as a recalibration, a violent turnover in power that maintains the status quo of galactic hegemony. The final medal ceremony, characterized by its performative, uniform rigidity, suggests that the rebellion is already coalescing into its own version of the very state it replaced. The camera's movement through these cold, polished halls underscores the lack of organic escape. We are left with the realization that the struggle was never about achieving freedom, but about finding a place within the existing hierarchy. The film concludes not with the triumph of the human spirit, but with the chilling finality of a system that has successfully consumed the last remaining variable of dissent, molding it into the shape of its own survival. The cycle remains unbroken, and the war, by necessity, must continue. The anomaly question. Star Wars: A New Hope is often characterized as a foundational myth of archetypal good versus evil, a space-bound fairy tale that relies on clear-cut moral binaries. Yet, this reading obscures the film's true nature, a rigorous study of the tension between mechanical determinism and individual transcendence. The anomaly of the film, the moment the Force is introduced not as a religious abstraction, but as a tangible, disruptive field that overrides technological supremacy, reveals the film's thesis. The narrative existence of A New Hope centers on the collapse of a technocratic hegemony, proving that in a universe governed by totalizing systems, salvation lies only in the abandonment of logical ego in favor of intuitive surrender. The world of A New Hope is defined by the absolute scarcity of agency. The Empire operates as a supreme bureaucratic machine, where the control of space is achieved through the total commodification of reality. The Death Star serves as the ultimate architectural manifestation of this worldview. It is a sterile, frictionless environment where geography is discarded for a repeating, industrial grid. In this reality, the individual is rendered obsolete. Luke Skywalker begins his journey as a laborer bound to the dust and rust of Tatooine, a fringe planet where value is determined solely by one's utility to the machine. His existence is defined by the repetitive maintenance of obsolete technology, a microcosm of a society where even the most vibrant spirits are reduced to keeping the status quo operational. The film establishes that this technological hegemony is an epistemic prison. The ruling class maintains order through the erasure of the metaphysical. When characters like Han Solo dismiss the Force as a parlor trick, they are voicing the film's baseline state of cynicism, a belief that if a phenomenon cannot be measured, weaponized, or bought, it does not exist. However, the film posits that this materialism is a lie. The Force acts as the anomaly that breaks the structural integrity of the imperial worldview. When Obi-Wan Kenobi guides Luke to trust his instincts rather than his targeting computer, he is rejecting the very system that has kept the galaxy in stasis. This act is the ultimate rebellion. It is not a fight between two armies, but a clash between a worldview based on the quantification of power and a philosophy based on the qualitative experience of the soul. The human element of the film is marked by a profound epistemic fracture. Luke's development is not merely a coming-of-age arc, but a process of unlearning. His trauma, the loss of his aunt and uncle, is the necessary catalyst that shatters his attachment to his former life. The visual language of the film supports this internal shift. As Luke transitions from the claustrophobic, earth-toned interiors of his home to the hyper-rationalized, metallic corridors of the Death Star, he becomes the singular variable that the system cannot calculate. While the Imperial officers are defined by their strict adherence to procedure and the cold projection of their authority, Luke's actions become increasingly guided by a state of presence that transcends the immediate sensory input of his environment. Technically, the film's execution serves this philosophical argument through a deliberate layering of the practical and the ephemeral. The film's aesthetic is famously used, characterized by dirt, grease, and mechanical failure, which grounds the high-concept fantasy in a tangible, decaying reality. This visual texture serves as the perfect foil for the ethereal nature of the Force. When the film cuts to the silence of space or the blinding, abstract white of the Death Star's interior, it creates a sensory environment where the miracle of intuitive action feels earned. The sound design, particularly the shift from the heavy, thrumming industrial noise of the ship interiors to the hum of the lightsaber or the sudden stillness of the cockpit during the trench run, reinforces the idea that the protagonist is reaching for a different frequency of reality. The climactic trench run serves as the synthesis of these ideas. When Luke turns off his targeting computer, he is performing an act of radical decommodification. He refuses to allow his survival to be mediated by the machine. In that moment, the film's thesis is proven: the machine is powerful, but it is ultimately limited by its own logic. By embracing the irrational, the subjective, and the metaphysical, the individual does not just survive the system, they dismantle it. A New Hope concludes not with the establishment of a new order, but with a momentary liberation. The celebration at the end is not a victory of politics, but a restoration of possibility. The film suggests that the struggle against oppressive systems is a recurring necessity, and that the force is merely the term for the persistent human capacity to act outside the constraints of the predicted outcome. The legacy of the film is found in this specific, haunting realization: in a universe designed to quantify, categorize, and control, the only truly subversive act is to stop looking at the instruments and start trusting the instinct toward liberation. The film leaves the viewer with the understanding that the tools of the oppressor are designed to fail whenever they encounter a spirit that refuses to be defined by the grid. The synthesis question. Star Wars, Episode 4: A New Hope is frequently categorized as a quintessential mythic adventure, a binary struggle between the virtues of a democratic rebellion and the mechanical cruelty of a totalitarian empire. However, this consensus obscures the film's more profound function as a document regarding the reclamation of individual agency from a system of pervasive technological and spiritual entropy. The film argues that the universe is not merely decaying due to political conflict, but is actively suffering from an epistemic collapse where human intuition has been supplanted by rigid, commodified bureaucracy. The anomaly of the Death Star, a moon-sized construct that functions as a prison, a weapon, and a bureaucratic state, serves as the physical manifestation of this argument. By synthesizing the psychology of Luke Skywalker's transition from a rural laborer to a cosmic pilot with the sociological decay of a galaxy reliant on salvaged technology, the film proves that the only viable response to totalizing systems is the radical reassertion of the individual spirit through faith in the unseen. The galaxy is defined by scarcity and the persistent devaluation of labor. Tatooine, in its role as a remote, sun-bleached dumping ground, establishes a baseline of existence where human potential is tethered to the moisture vaporator and the repair of obsolete machinery. The visual geography, defined by rust, grime, and the integration of the organic with the discarded mechanical, reveals a society that has lost the ability to innovate, subsisting instead on the remains of a forgotten era. Characters navigate this landscape as scavengers, their worth measured by their utility to the scrap heap. This economic stagnation is reinforced by the architectural hierarchy of the Death Star, where the ruling class exists in sterile, cold, and mathematically precise environments, far removed from the cluttered, subterranean grit inhabited by the working populace. The Empire represents the final stage of institutional control, where history is suppressed, information is curated as propaganda, and the individual is reduced to a serial number within a vast, cold infrastructure. The psychological journey of Luke Skywalker is a reaction to this structural erasure. His foundational trauma, the loss of his guardians, is not merely an act of violence, but the catalyst that breaks his epistemic enclosure. Before this, his ego is constructed around a desire to conform to the expectations of his uncle, a man who views the world through a narrow, agrarian lens. Luke's development is characterized by the tension between the restrictive language of his binary life and the call of a larger, metaphysical vocabulary that he cannot yet articulate. The film uses the Force not as a magical plot device, but as the only alternative to the Empire's reliance on data and technological dominance. When Luke finally maneuvers his ship into the trench of the Death Star, he chooses to disengage his targeting computer, a symbolic rejection of the mechanical, objective, and predetermined. By trusting his intuition, he transitions from a cog in a machine to a sovereign actor. This ethical shift is fundamentally an act of rebellion against the philosophy of determinism. The Empire operates on a model of perfect calculation and total surveillance, assuming that any threat can be modeled and liquidated. The rebels, conversely, succeed because they embrace the absurdity of their situation. Confronted with a weapon designed to ensure complete control, they choose to act in a way that is statistically impossible. The moral calculus of the film favors the individual's subjective conviction over the state's utilitarian arrogance. The technical execution supports this through the contrast between the film's practical effects and its more sterile environments. The tactile, lived-in quality of the hardware, the worn buttons, the smoke, the leaking pipes, creates a sensory reality that insists on the messy, unpredictable nature of human life. This aesthetic choice ensures that the viewer experiences the triumph not as a victory of superior technology, but as a victory of spirit over the soul-crushing silence of the void. Ultimately, the film leaves us with the image of a hero who has transcended his station, yet it implicitly suggests that the cycle of rebellion is infinite. The struggle against the encroaching shadow is not a final act, but an ongoing necessity in a universe that constantly gravitates toward order, control, and the suppression of the human element. The film's enduring legacy lies in its insistence that when systems grow too heavy and truth becomes too mediated, the act of reclaiming one's own perception is the only genuine source of power. Through the lens of the final trench run, the film demonstrates that history is not written by the keepers of records or the builders of massive monuments, but by the individuals who dare to define their own reality in the face of impossible odds. The collapse of the Death Star is the visual proof of this thesis. When the individual refuses to be a component of the state, the machine inevitably falters. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. Star Wars Episode IV: A New Hope operates as a definitive study of systemic scarcity and the brutal economics of a galaxy fractured by imperial consolidation. At the foundation of this universe lies a desperate competition for material resources, where the fundamental currency is defined by the hardware required for survival in inhospitable environments. The Empire maintains its monopoly on order not merely through political decree, but through the absolute physical control of high-tier infrastructure. This control is visualized through the sleek, sterile, and hyper-efficient architecture of Imperial starships and death-dealing technology, which stand in stark contrast to the rust-choked, scavenged existence of the periphery. By centralizing the means of technological production, the Empire forces the civilian population into a state of perpetual maintenance, where the survival of the individual depends on the reclamation of discarded parts from the refuse of a decaying golden age. This economic reality dictates the life of a civilian on a world like Tatooine, where the baseline normal is a grueling struggle against environmental degradation. For characters like Luke Skywalker, a standard day is defined by the commodification of labor through domestic technology. Droids serve as the primary proxy for the labor force, representing a world where intellect and consciousness are commodified assets, traded and repaired like common tools. The reliance on these mechanical entities illustrates a society that has effectively externalized the burden of technical expertise. When a droid is bought or sold, the transaction is less about the exchange of a sentient being and more about the acquisition of specific, proprietary data sets, blueprints, navigation logs, or technical schematics that hold the keys to movement across the galaxy. This reveals a world starved of objective context. Information is the most precious raw material, hidden within the memory banks of machines to prevent it from reaching those who would challenge the status quo. The existence of a black market, found in the shadowed cantinas and dimly lit docking bays of Mos Eisley, confirms exactly what the imperial system suppresses: free agency and unmonitored transit. Within these hubs of illicit activity, characters navigate a space where the state's laws are replaced by the transactional ethics of smugglers and mercenaries. This shadow economy exists as a direct reaction to the Empire's technological gatekeeping. Because the ruling class restricts the highest tier of tech, the desperate must rely on obsolete or physically dangerous hardware to bypass regional blockades. Every ship that lifts off from Tatooine is a testament to the ingenuity of the disenfranchised, who must perform constant, improvised repairs on outdated systems to maintain a sliver of autonomy. The visual geography of the film emphasizes this disparity. The polished, smooth surfaces of Imperial command centers serve as the psychological mirror to the claustrophobic, cluttered, and rusted-out spaces inhabited by the galaxy's forgotten populations. Labor in this universe is inextricably linked to the physical decay of the environment. Scavenging is not a hobby but the primary mode of survival, establishing a cycle where individuals remain tethered to the wreckage of previous eras. The film presents this as the ultimate manifestation of a society collapsing under the weight of its own administrative scale. By treating bodies and consciousness as expendable components in a massive, unfeeling machine, the Empire effectively strips the citizenry of any identity beyond their utility to the system. The tension of the inciting incident, the arrival of the droids, is heightened specifically because it disrupts this bleak, agrarian monotony. When the technology meant to sustain the status quo suddenly introduces revolutionary data, the facade of a managed, predictable existence shatters. The protagonist's journey is therefore fundamentally an act of reclamation. He moves from the bottom of the socio-economic ladder, where he is a mere technician of scrap, to a position where he must master the very technology that the Empire uses to enforce its singular, crushing truth. In this landscape, the mastery of hardware is synonymous with the reclamation of history, forcing the individual to decide whether to remain a cog in the imperial engine or to dismantle the mechanisms of scarcity entirely. Architecture and the Visual Geography. Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope operates as a profound exploration of the tension between the decaying remnants of a bygone era and the sterile, crushing imposition of an emergent totalitarian order. The visual language of the film establishes a clear architectural hierarchy that mirrors the socio-political stratification of the galaxy. On planets like Tatooine, the architecture is subterranean and organic, defined by the erosion of rock and the necessity of scavenging. Life here is lived in the ruins of a forgotten history, where moisture vaporators and rusted droids serve as the only bridge between a primitive environment and a technological past. This visual geography creates a sense of profound scale, emphasizing that the individual exists within the debris of a grand, lost civilization. The clutter of the desert dwellings functions as a manifestation of a populace that manages scarcity by repurposing the husks of dead technology, grounding the narrative in a world that is fundamentally broken and layered with the sediment of time. In direct contrast, the Galactic Empire occupies a visual realm of absolute, frictionless geometry. The architecture of the Death Star and the Star Destroyers represents a totalizing vision of order that rejects the organic messiness of the Outer Rim. These environments are characterized by vast, sterile corridors, sharp linear silhouettes, and monochromatic grays that suppress any hint of natural growth. The production design utilizes these spaces to enforce a power structure predicated on efficiency and surveillance. While the desert inhabitants are filmed in cramped, shadowed, and chaotic spaces that force them to navigate their environment with tactile struggle, the agents of the Empire glide through massive, echoing transit spaces that render the human form insignificant. This geometry of control is designed to dwarf the individual, projecting an image of the state as an unstoppable, monolithic entity that occupies the entirety of a character's field of vision. The film effectively uses these environments to articulate a philosophy of technological gatekeeping. High-tier technology, the laser, the artificial gravity, the massive starship, is sequestered within the sterile, vertical enclaves of the Imperial Center, while the periphery is defined by obsolete, discarded hardware. This creates a geography of navigation where the protagonist's movement is always a trajectory from the chaotic, sun-scorched, and rusted lowlands toward the cold, synthetic silence of the Imperial core. The cinematography captures this progression by shifting from handheld, intimate perspectives that feel the weight of dust and sand, to wide, expansive, and perfectly centered shots that communicate the chilling perfection of Imperial engineering. The VFX of scale, achieved through a masterful integration of practical models, matte paintings, and dynamic lighting, serves to highlight the vulnerability of the individual against the system. When a character stands before a Star Destroyer, the frame isolates them in the corner of a vast, looming shape, demonstrating how easily the Empire consumes human presence. The Empire's architecture is not merely a backdrop but a character that embodies the rejection of the organic in favor of a rigid, artificial supremacy. By positioning its heroes within the rusted-out ruins of a golden age and forcing them to confront the pristine, terrifying architecture of the new regime, the film demonstrates that the true conflict is between a world of human accumulation and a world of mechanical erasure. The visual geography insists that the rebellion is not just a tactical choice, but an existential attempt to reclaim the messiness, the history, and the organic reality of a galaxy that is being systematically sterilized by the architecture of absolute control. The final image of the film, culminating in the destruction of the Death Star, represents the violent collapse of this rigid geometry, returning the narrative focus to the triumph of the individual over the suffocating, engineered perfection of the state. Epistemology, information, and society. Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope operates as a profound exploration of the fragility of information and the way state-sanctioned historical narratives are imposed upon a galaxy of fragmented, disconnected realities. The film establishes an epistemic hierarchy where truth is a function of access. At the center of the Empire's power is not merely its military hardware, but its absolute monopoly over the historical record. The Galactic Empire maintains order by aggressively starving its populace of context, replacing the messy, complex history of the Old Republic and the Jedi Order with a simplified, monolithic administrative reality. By the time the story begins, the Jedi are relegated to the status of an obscure, mythic footnote, and the history of the Clone Wars is obscured by the systematic destruction of archives and the suppression of dissident accounts. In this world, the ruling class functions as the sole arbiter of truth. The Empire communicates via the cold, bureaucratic delivery of imperial decrees and the terrifying, silence-enforcing presence of the Death Star, which serves as the ultimate visual symbol of the state's epistemological control. The propaganda engine is essentially architectural. The sterile, featureless corridors of the Death Star represent a physical manifestation of an ideology that demands the erasure of individual history and cultural variance. Information is treated as a dangerous commodity that must be contained, encrypted, and physically sequestered within vessels like the Tantive or the hidden, portable memory banks of droids like R2-D2. The film demonstrates that in an authoritarian regime, data becomes a form of resistance, and the act of retrieving, translating, and broadcasting forbidden information is the primary catalyst for the collapse of the imperial illusion. The society depicted in the film is profoundly stratified by its relationship to the flow of information. On planets like Tatooine, individuals exist in a state of epistemological exile, disconnected from the core power structures and trapped in a cycle of subsistence labor. Characters such as Luke Skywalker are defined by what they do not know. His baseline reality is restricted to the immediate, tactile concerns of moisture farming and the repetitive maintenance of obsolete droids. He occupies an out-group status, geographically and socially removed from the galactic center, where the truth of the galaxy is mediated entirely through rumors, hearsay, and the fading remnants of the past. When Obi-Wan Kenobi introduces Luke to the history of his father and the Force, he is not merely teaching a skill, he is restoring a suppressed context that has been surgically removed from the public consciousness. The contrast between the organic, chaotic life of the Outer Rim and the synthetic, hyper-regulated environment of the Imperial core underscores the film's philosophical argument regarding the commodification of human experience. The Empire seeks to transition the galaxy into a state of total, predictable efficiency, where the complexities of individual belief systems are replaced by the singular, measurable logic of the Tarkin doctrine. However, the film asserts that truth cannot be entirely suppressed. It persists in the form of marginalized knowledge kept by exiles and scattered across the galaxy in scavenged, salvaged hardware. The droids act as conduits for this forbidden history, their presence serving as a reminder that even in a society that claims to have moved beyond the past, that past remains embedded within the very technology the Empire utilizes to maintain its dominance. Ultimately, the film posits that the struggle for freedom is synonymous with the struggle for historical record. The rebels succeed because they manage to extract, interpret, and weaponize the technical truths, the schematics of the Death Star, that the Empire deems too dangerous for the public to possess. The destruction of the Death Star is the ultimate rejection of the Empire's propaganda engine. By exposing the structural vulnerability of the state's most powerful tool of intimidation, the rebels demonstrate that the Empire's reality is not a natural, inevitable fact, but a fragile construction built upon lies. The film illustrates that when the information-starved receive the context they were denied, the grand narrative of the ruling class crumbles, revealing that the normalcy imposed by the state was merely a temporary, artificial silence. The synthesis of this world shows us that personal agency is inextricably linked to the ability to know, remember, and speak the truth against a system designed to ensure that history is only ever what the authorities decide it should be. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope operates as a foundational myth that posits the triumph of individual spiritual intuition over the suffocating machinery of bureaucratic totalitarianism. While audiences often perceive the film as a straightforward space opera concerning the battle between good and evil, the narrative is an intricate examination of how systemic decay necessitates the rise of the radicalized individual. The film argues that power, when stripped of its moral anchor and transformed into a closed-loop system of state-sanctioned surveillance and industrial cruelty, inevitably alienates its citizenry to the point of existential rupture. The world of A New Hope is defined by a rigid, claustrophobic architecture of control. On the Death Star, space is sterile, frictionless, and devoid of organic life, reflecting a reality where human presence is reduced to a uniform cog in a vast, cold apparatus. This is a universe governed by a pervasive, monolithic authority, the Galactic Empire, which has effectively commodified the galaxy's resources and suppressed all history that predates its current administrative hegemony. Technology in this world acts as a tool of ontological erasure. The Empire maintains its grip through a monopoly on force and the aggressive regulation of information. For the denizens of the Outer Rim, such as Luke Skywalker on Tatooine, existence is defined by the scarcity of both agency and opportunity. Theirs is a life of scavenging the literal refuse of a decaying golden age, surviving on the rusted, discarded remnants of a civilization that preceded the current, suffocating order. The Empire functions as an entity that has eclipsed the concept of governance in favor of pure, extractive logistics. Punishment is not a mechanism for societal rehabilitation but a performance of absolute dominance, designed to render dissent physically impossible through the threat of planetary annihilation. This creates an environment where the baseline experience is one of perpetual, low-level anxiety. When the protagonist finally enters the orbit of the Empire, he encounters a system that is essentially a self-reinforcing feedback loop of steel and silence. The conflict arises because the Empire, in its pursuit of absolute technological superiority, has reached a tipping point. The creation of the Death Star represents a shift toward a state of totalizing control that leaves no room for the messy, unpredictable nature of human life. This inherent fragility is the system's primary flaw. It is a structure so focused on the preservation of its own scale that it becomes blind to the significance of the individual. Luke Skywalker's journey from a frustrated farmhand to a catalyst for systemic change is grounded in the painful discovery of his own epistemological limitations. His internal reality is shattered when the narrative of his own lineage and the history of the Jedi are revealed to be suppressed truths. This epistemic fracture is the engine of his transformation. He is a character who begins with a self-conception limited by his geographic and social isolation, only to be forced into a broader, more dangerous truth. His mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, serves as a vessel for the ancient, repressed knowledge of the Force, providing a vocabulary that allows Luke to process his environment beyond the mechanical materialism of the Empire. This transition is not merely intellectual, it is deeply somatic. Throughout his journey, Luke's survival depends on his ability to move away from reliance on technical sensors and computer-assisted targeting, embracing instead a form of intuitive perception that rejects the Empire's digital hegemony. The film's central philosophical conflict is represented by the dichotomy between the sterile, machine-like logic of the Empire and the organic, interconnected philosophy of the Force. The Empire views the galaxy as a map to be controlled and a resource to be harvested, while the protagonists operate under the belief that reality is a shared, luminous experience that transcends physical borders. This is a radical rejection of the Empire's objective, data-driven worldview. The destruction of the Death Star is the ultimate manifestation of this philosophy. It is a moment where the irrational faith of the individual overrides the mathematically precise calculations of the superweapon. The film argues that the system, for all its colossal scale and industrial might, is ultimately hollow because it lacks an ontological connection to the life it seeks to dominate. Technically, the film reinforces this thematic divide through its masterful use of scale and texture. The production design contrasts the grit of the lived-in world with the oppressive, shadow-drenched geometry of imperial corridors. The special effects work to emphasize the insignificance of the individual, often placing the protagonists in tiny, fragile vessels against the backdrop of massive, impenetrable warships. By maintaining a tactile, lived-in aesthetic, where everything is stained, dented, or worn, the film grounds its epic scale in human reality. This visual language ensures that the final triumph feels like a victory for the tangible, breathing world against an abstract, uncaring force of order. Ultimately, A New Hope asserts that the responsibility for liberation rests entirely with the individual's willingness to step outside the prescribed boundaries of their society. The collapse of the Empire is not a result of superior military technology, but a consequence of its own refusal to account for the unpredictable nature of the human spirit. The film concludes not with the total destruction of the system's underlying mechanisms, but with a foundational act of courage that proves the system is not as omnipotent as it claims. It is an exploration of the inherent, persistent vulnerability of all closed-loop regimes when faced with an individual who chooses to believe in a reality beyond the state's mediation. The legacy of the film lies in this simple, enduring proposition, that one's consciousness is the primary site of resistance, and that the first act of defiance is the decision to look beyond the architecture of one's own containment. Part 3. The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. Star Wars: A New Hope functions as a rigorous examination of the epistemic shift required for an individual to transcend a localized, provincial reality. Luke Skywalker begins the narrative within the restrictive confines of a manufactured identity, believing himself to be a moisture farmer defined solely by filial obligation and domestic geography. His psychological architecture is built upon the promise of stability, an ego constructed through the repetitive, grueling labor of desert survival. This fabricated self is essential to his survival. By limiting his ambitions to the harvest, he remained shielded from the violent turbulence of the wider galaxy. However, the film asserts that this ignorance is a self-imposed prison, a state of existence where the limits of his vocabulary, specifically his lack of understanding regarding the Force, define the absolute boundaries of his world. The foundational epistemic fracture occurs the moment Obi-Wan Kenobi presents the scorched remains of his aunt and uncle. At this juncture, the narrative of his life as a bystander is obliterated. Luke is forced to confront the reality that his previous existence was a fragile illusion maintained by the state's violent reach. His reaction is not one of calculated political awakening but of raw, somatic disorientation. The transition from the safety of his uncle's farm to the interior of the Millennium Falcon marks a shift from a world of tactile, manageable labor to one of abstract, metaphysical consequence. He is suddenly stripped of his defined role, forced to navigate an environment where his previous understanding of merit, hard work and obedience is irrelevant in the face of the Force, an external, non-rational power that defies his utilitarian upbringing. This trauma is deeply rooted in the limitations of his initial linguistic framework. Throughout his time on Tatooine, Luke's speech is functional and observational, suited for the scarcity of his environment. He lacks the conceptual tools to articulate the dissonance he feels regarding his own destiny, often resorting to silence or questioning that reveals his intellectual confinement. When he encounters the Jedi teachings, he is not merely learning a combat technique, he is acquiring a new syntax for his own existence. The Force provides the vocabulary necessary to reconcile his internal dissatisfaction with the objective emptiness of his reality. His journey is an attempt to map this new metaphysical language onto the physical destruction of the Death Star. Cognitive dissonance permeates his arc, particularly when he is forced to integrate the lethal necessities of conflict into his emergent moral framework. As he moves from the innocent farm boy to an operative of the Rebel Alliance, he must reconcile the act of killing with his stated sense of self. The film avoids a traditional internal monologue, instead manifesting this conflict through his kinetic desperation in the cockpit of an X-Wing. His justification is not articulated through dialogue, but through an intuitive surrender to a power beyond his ego. He resolves the tension between his desire for autonomy and the demands of the galactic struggle by delegating his agency to a higher, universal imperative. The antagonist, Darth Vader, serves as the ultimate mirror to this internal transformation. Vader is the manifestation of what Luke could become if he allows his resentment toward the status quo to solidify into a rigid, ideological weapon. Vader represents a completed, static ego, a man who has fully surrendered his humanity to the system he serves. Luke's growth is defined by his rejection of this finality. While Vader exists within a closed loop of cold logic and imperial authority, Luke's evolution is characterized by an open, fluid engagement with the unknown. By the time he successfully targets the Death Star's exhaust port, he has discarded the fabricated ego of the moisture farmer entirely. The final act of the film is not merely a military victory, but a psychological culmination. Luke acts not as a cog in the rebellion, but as a sovereign agent who has successfully synthesized the disparate fragments of his identity into a coherent, self-actualized whole. The film's legacy remains grounded in this specific metamorphosis, proposing that the ultimate rebellion against an oppressive system is the rejection of the limited, predefined self. Trauma and somatic experiencing. Star Wars: A New Hope operates as a profound exploration of trauma and somatic experience, grounding its cosmic stakes in the intimate, visceral reality of its characters. At the center of this psychological landscape is Luke Skywalker, whose development is driven not merely by the external call to heroism, but by a foundational wound, the phantom absence of a family he has never known. This core trauma manifests as a pervasive sense of displacement. Luke lives within the arid, punishing environment of Tatooine, a geography that functions as a physical projection of his internal stagnation. He is an exile in his own home, tethered to a life of agricultural drudgery that serves as a sensory reminder of his lack of agency. The film keeps the specifics of his parentage shrouded, mirroring the way trauma often renders the past an abstract, inaccessible space. It is only when the binary sunset burns into his retinas, a moment where the film shifts from mundane chores to existential yearning, that we recognize his somatic response to an origin he cannot name. The film meticulously tracks how this trauma is stored within the body. For Luke, the physical manifestations of his distress are reactive. He is defined by a restlessness that manifests in his constant tinkering with salvaged technology. This repetition compulsion is an attempt to master the chaotic, broken remnants of a world he does not control. By repairing droids and obsessing over flight simulators, Luke exerts a mechanical influence over a reality that has otherwise denied him the truth of his history. His body is a vessel for this unspent energy, and his impatience with the provincial safety of his aunt and uncle's farm is a physical rejection of a life that suppresses his latent potential. In contrast, the character of Darth Vader presents a harrowing study of the trauma of the body itself. If Luke is a boy struggling to understand his place in the world, Vader is a man who has fully surrendered to the logic of the machine. The film renders Vader as an entity almost entirely defined by augmentation. He is the ultimate expression of the body as a prison. His rhythmic, mechanical breathing is the definitive diegetic trigger for the audience, signaling a state of constant, automated hypervigilance. While Luke searches for a future, Vader is a static monument to the past, his physical form a series of technological interventions designed to contain the wreckage of his prior existence. This creates a powerful somatic irony. The hero is a young man striving to inhabit his humanity, while the villain is a figure who has been structurally and psychologically dismantled by the very systems he enforces. The relationship between flesh and hardware serves as the film's most enduring psychological metaphor. For the desert scavengers and rebels, technology is weathered, oxidized, and temperamental, an extension of their own vulnerability. Their ships and tools are scarred by use, mirroring the weariness of those living under the thumb of an imperial bureaucracy. Conversely, the Empire's architecture is sleek, sterile, and cold. In the corridors of the Death Star, characters are dwarfed by an environment that demands uniformity. The film utilizes this spatial psychology to highlight the disconnect between the individual and the state. When Luke and his companions navigate the Death Star, their movements are erratic and desperate, a sharp contrast to the precise, measured strides of stormtroopers. This is the visual language of the traumatized. They are people trying to survive within a machine that is specifically designed to eliminate the unpredictability of human emotion. Ultimately, A New Hope argues that the path through trauma requires a shift in how one interacts with the world. Luke's journey is one of integration, learning to trust the invisible, intuitive force over the rigid, data-driven parameters of his environment. His final act in the trench of the Death Star is the ultimate somatic release. He turns off his targeting computer, silencing the technology that mediates his reality and relying instead on an internal, authentic sense of truth. This action is the antithesis of the Empire's reliance on the absolute, crushing scale of its own weaponry. By prioritizing the human element over the technical, the film validates the individual's capacity to transcend their origins. The trauma of the orphan is not cured, but it is repurposed into a source of power, allowing the protagonist to dismantle the very system that sought to isolate him. The resonance of this story lies in that specific triumph, a recognition that even in a galaxy defined by cold, mechanical oppression, the most profound resistance begins with the willingness to inhabit one's own experience with total, unmediated presence. The shadow and the antagonist. A New Hope operates as an intricate study of the human condition, where the interplay between the protagonist, Luke Skywalker, and the primary antagonist, Darth Vader, functions as a profound Jungian exploration of the psyche. Vader stands as the literal manifestation of Luke's repressed potential and the terrifying consequences of unresolved trauma. While the narrative positions Luke as the budding hero, his internal journey is defined by a desperate search for identity within a vacuum of historical truth. Vader serves as the dark mirror, embodying the cold, systematic pragmatism that Luke fears but must eventually confront within himself. The villain's worldview is inherently logical from his own perspective. He acts as an agent of order, seeking to stabilize a fractured, chaotic galaxy through absolute control. Vader functions as a pragmatist who views individual agency as a nuisance, a belief system that stems from a rigid adherence to the necessity of structural stability at any human cost. This psychological reflection extends through the presence of mirror characters, most notably in the form of Han Solo. Han and Luke are presented with the same existential catalyst, the call to abandon their insular, stagnant lives, yet they navigate the decision with fundamentally different methodologies. Han operates as the cynic who attempts to commodify his own survival, treating his ship and his labor as capital to be leveraged against a predatory system. Luke, conversely, operates from a position of intuitive faith. The tension between them reveals the fragility of their respective coping mechanisms. Luke projects his own anxieties about powerlessness onto Han, viewing Han's detachment as a moral failure, while Han views Luke's idealism as a dangerous, fatal delusion. Their relationship evolves from a transactional, parasitic dynamic into a symbiotic one, where the emotional capital exchanged allows both to transcend their initial, limited perspectives. The tragedy of the antagonist's logic is that it mirrors the very discipline Luke is taught to master. Both characters utilize a specialized, exclusionary knowledge system, the Force, to exert influence over their reality. As Luke learns to harness this energy, he must grapple with the reality that his own potential for violence and absolute assertion is identical to that of his adversary. The film illustrates the protagonist's growth through this recognition. Luke does not defeat the shadow by destroying it, but by acknowledging the shared lineage of their power. The projection of the hero's flaw, his impatience, his thirst for recognition, and his desire to escape his terrestrial insignificance, finds its ultimate expression in the Death Star, a technological monument to the very arrogance Luke must suppress to succeed. By grounding the conflict in these intimate psychological dynamics, the film transforms the grand galactic struggle into a personal excavation of the soul. The antagonist is not a distant, incomprehensible force, but a looming outcome of the protagonist's own trajectory. Vader represents the endpoint of a life governed entirely by the suppression of empathy in favor of instrumental efficiency. Consequently, the hero's path requires the integration of this shadow. Luke's journey serves as a rejection of the binary that would make the antagonist an alien entity, demanding instead that he accept the capacity for darkness as a baseline requirement for meaningful human action. The film establishes that true agency is found only when the hero reconciles the external threat with the internal mirror, turning the realization of the shadow into the primary catalyst for his own eventual transformation. The visual proof of the psyche. In Star Wars, Episode IV, A New Hope, the film operates as a profound exploration of human identity forged through the crucible of structural isolation. The visual language of the film consistently prioritizes the character's internal psychological state, utilizing the vast, indifferent geography of the galaxy to underscore the fragility of the individual. Luke Skywalker begins his journey as an entity defined entirely by his environment, the desolate, sun-drenched wasteland of Tatooine. Here, the cinematography isolates him within wide, sweeping shots of the desert, where the sheer negative space of the dunes renders his domestic anxieties invisible to the uncaring system of the Empire. This spatial strategy establishes his early ego as a construct of confinement. He is a prisoner not merely of the sand, but of a lack of agency. The film manifests this psychological entrapment through the contrast between the open, desolate landscapes and the claustrophobic, sterile corridors of the Death Star. As Luke transitions from the periphery to the heart of the Imperial apparatus, his psyche undergoes a fracturing process. The transition from the organic, sun-bleached world of the homestead to the cold, rhythmic, and synthetic light of the space station acts as a visual map of his ego's destruction. Within the Death Star, the lighting is intentionally flat and uniform, designed to strip away the warmth of individuality. Characters in these zones often adopt a chillingly systematic posture, mirroring the rigid, pre-programmed morality of the machine world they inhabit. Luke's movement through these spaces is defined by a visible shift from the performative, frustrated energy of a farm boy to the vulnerable, stripped-down focus of a survivor. The film utilizes diegetic triggers to force the character into an acknowledgement of his own trauma. The piercing, mechanical wail of the tractor beam and the rhythmic, ominous respiration of Darth Vader serve as auditory manifestations of the inescapable shadow that looms over Luke's origin. These sounds penetrate the silence of his isolation, acting as reminders that the Empire is a psychological architecture that reaches into his very psyche. When Luke finally experiences the death of his mentor, the camera holds on his face in a way that suggests the total collapse of his previous, binary understanding of reality. This is the visual proof of his internal maturation, the moment the facade of the hero's journey drops to reveal the raw, unadorned weight of loss. Moreover, the film masterfully employs framing to isolate its protagonists even amidst a crowd. Whether in the bustling, chaotic transit zones of Mos Eisley or the sterile, clinical observation decks of the Empire, the characters are frequently framed against large, impersonal backgrounds that suggest their insignificance against the scale of the state. This VFX-driven isolation serves the thematic argument that the human spirit exists in a perpetual state of friction against systems that seek to commodify or erase it. By placing the individual in environments that dwarf them, the film highlights the psychological necessity of internalizing one's own meaning. The shift from the performative, Luke's posturing at the cantina or his bluster in the hangar, to the vulnerable, his meditative silence within the cockpit of an X-Wing, reveals a character shedding the skin of his projected ego. As he descends into the trench of the Death Star, the camera tightens, the world outside the cockpit fades into a blur, and the technical complexity of the craft gives way to the simplicity of human instinct. This is the ultimate visual resolution of the psyche, the triumph of the singular human will over a vast, automated, and soulless structure. The film concludes by demonstrating that while the world remains indifferent and the machinery of power continues to churn, the internal work of identifying one's selfhood amidst that void provides the only sustainable refuge for the individual. The legacy of A New Hope lies in this precise technical and psychological alignment, where the grandiosity of the spectacle is always, and intentionally, secondary to the quiet, painful process of a person finding their own voice within a chorus of total, technological control. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. Star Wars, Episode 4 A New Hope operates as a profound exploration of the transition from a post-truth, materialist regime to a reality governed by metaphysical intuition. While the Galactic Empire maintains order through the strict regulation of discourse and the centralization of information, the film posits that objective truth remains an immutable force that exists beyond the reach of state propaganda. The Empire functions as an epistemic monolith, constructing a reality where the tangible evidence of technology and military might constitutes the entirety of existence. By suppressing the history of the Jedi and the existence of the Force, the imperial state forces its subjects to operate within a diminished linguistic and conceptual framework. In this environment, the limits of the citizen's language, confined to the mechanical functions of industry and the rigid hierarchies of bureaucracy, effectively define the limits of their perceived reality. The imperial propaganda machine functions as the primary arbiter of truth, utilizing the fear of the Death Star to solidify a metanarrative of absolute security through total control. For the average inhabitant of this galaxy, reality is mediated entirely through the lenses of state-sanctioned communication and the surveillance of local planetary governors. The Empire's reliance on the Tarkin doctrine, ruled by fear of force rather than force itself, highlights their objective to replace individual discernment with a singular, state-imposed perception. By stripping the populace of their connection to the wider, mystical history of the galaxy, the Empire creates a vacuum of meaning that allows the Death Star to serve as both a weapon and a symbol of ultimate, unchallengeable authority. However, the film consistently demonstrates that the imperial epistemic authority is fundamentally incomplete. The rebellion and the emergence of Luke Skywalker represent the reclamation of a broader, more authentic mode of knowledge. When Obi-Wan Kenobi introduces Luke to the concept of the Force, he is not merely teaching a combat technique, he is restoring a lost language that allows Luke to perceive the world beyond the material constraints established by the Empire. This epistemological shift marks a transition from a reliance on empirical, technological data, such as the guidance systems of X-Wing targeting computers, to an intuitive engagement with the underlying fabric of the universe. The film posits that truth is found through internal alignment rather than external consensus. Luke's journey is defined by his rejection of the Empire's mediated reality in favor of a deeper, experimental connection to the environment. The climax of the film, where Luke chooses to switch off his targeting computer, serves as the ultimate rejection of the technological and epistemic monopoly held by the state. By grounding his actions in the metaphysical reality of the Force, Luke proves that the Empire's reliance on purely materialist, logical control is susceptible to failure. The technological superiority of the Death Star, while formidable, is ultimately undermined by the pilot's ability to access a form of truth that the imperial system lacks the vocabulary to account for or neutralize. Furthermore, the film suggests that the individual maintains a moral obligation to seek truth even when the official record dictates otherwise. The existence of the Jedi, as remembered by those living on the fringes of the core systems, acts as a counter-discourse that refuses to be erased. Through characters like Ben Kenobi, the film asserts that historical continuity is preserved not in the archives of the state, but in the memory and practice of the initiated. This decentralized knowledge acts as the catalyst for systemic disruption. The Empire, believing itself to be the final word on reality, remains blind to the resurgence of this ancient, intuitive epistemology until it has already compromised their physical infrastructure. Ultimately, the film presents a universe where reality is not a static construct dictated by power, but an interactive landscape accessible to those willing to look past the superficial noise of authority. The ideological strength of the Empire is proven to be fragile precisely because it relies on a narrow, materialist interpretation of the world. By recentering human agency around a non-material, intuitive truth, the film validates the idea that objective reality can survive even the most pervasive efforts of a propaganda state. The victory at the Battle of Yavin is, therefore, a triumph of epistemology. It is the moment where the artificial limitations placed on the individual by a totalitarian machine are shattered by the emergence of a deeper, more profound understanding of the natural order. Through this, the film argues that the struggle for liberation is inherently an intellectual and perceptual awakening, one that requires the rejection of state-manufactured certainty in favor of a courageous embrace of the unknown. Metanarratives and social theory. Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope operates as a profound meditation on the collapse of a grand narrative, where the once vibrant philosophy of the Jedi has been relegated to the status of a fringe myth or a dusty relic. The film posits a universe where the structural decay of democracy has been replaced by the sterile, hyper-rationalized control of the Galactic Empire. This transition illustrates the failure of Enlightenment-era humanism to protect itself from the cold efficiency of totalizing state power. Before the inciting incident, the characters exist in a reality where the official history is a tactical fabrication, designed to erase the existence of the Force, a spiritual energy field, in favor of a materialist, technology-driven doctrine enforced by the Death Star. The Empire functions through a sophisticated network of ideological state apparatuses that maintain order not merely through the terror of their fleet, but through the deliberate erasure of the past. By the time the film begins, the Jedi Order, which once provided a moral and metaphysical center to the galaxy, has been successfully pathologized as a dangerous, superstitious cult. This historical revisionism turns the average citizen into an epistemologically starved subject, one who views the universe as a series of bureaucratic functions rather than a connected tapestry of life. Luke Skywalker begins his journey within this framework, trapped in a life of agrarian drudgery on Tatooine, his potential dampened by the lack of a vocabulary to describe his own internal yearnings. The scarcity of his environment, a literal and metaphorical desert, is the physical manifestation of the Empire's success in stripping the galaxy of its transcendent meaning. When Luke eventually encounters the remnants of the Old Guard, he undergoes an epistemic fracture. His reality, defined by the practical constraints of moisture farming and the limited horizons of his uncle's expectations, is shattered by the introduction of the Force. This is a move toward a re-enchantment of the world, wherein the protagonist must abandon the hyper-rationality of the Empire to embrace an ancient, non-empirical power. The film argues that the moral core of the universe resides in this subjective, intuitive connection to life, which exists in direct opposition to the Empire's technological obsession. The Death Star, as the ultimate achievement of this technocratic regime, is the physical embodiment of a death cult that seeks to quantify and destroy everything that cannot be owned or commanded by the state. Crucially, the conflict in A New Hope centers on the tension between deterministic, systemic control and the radical agency of the individual. The Empire views the galaxy as an engineering problem, a space to be occupied and managed through the monopoly of force. Conversely, the film asserts that true agency is found in the acceptance of the absurd, the willingness to trust in an invisible force and act for the benefit of the many without the guarantee of success. The climax of the film, where Luke chooses to switch off his targeting computer, represents a definitive rejection of the technological apparatus in favor of a higher, albeit unverifiable, truth. It is a moment of profound existential choice, prioritizing the human capacity for faith over the machine's capacity for calculation. The film's visual language reinforces this philosophical trajectory, contrasting the claustrophobic, monochrome corridors of the Death Star with the sprawling, colorful, and organic textures of the exterior worlds. The technical execution of the VFX, particularly the blending of practical models and optical composites, creates a sense of tactile reality that gives weight to the spiritual struggle. By grounding the metaphysical in the tangible, the film bridges the gap between the mundane and the mythic. A New Hope presents a compelling argument that when an entire society loses its connection to its history and its sense of the transcendent, the only path to restoration is a radical act of rebellion that begins within the self. The narrative concludes not with the total destruction of the system, but with the necessary ignition of hope, signaling that the collapse of a grand narrative is not the end of meaning, but an invitation to rebuild it through lived experience and the courage to perceive a reality that exists beyond the reach of state control. Ethics and the moral calculus. The moral framework of A New Hope operates as an intentional departure from the moral relativism often found in modern epic cinema, establishing instead a rigorous, duty-bound ethical landscape defined by the interplay between individual transcendence and collective survival. At the center of this framework is a robust commitment to deontological imperatives. Luke Skywalker's journey from the margins of a moisture farm to the heart of the Death Star represents an evolution from passive contentment to an active embrace of categorical duties. His choice to engage with the rebellion is not a calculation of comparative benefits, but an adherence to a moral necessity that overrides his immediate personal desires or the safety of his home. The film positions the act of service as an innate requirement of the individual, suggesting that personhood is fully realized only when one recognizes their obligation to the greater whole. This ethical structure is further interrogated through the film's treatment of non-human entities, specifically the droids, R2, the D2, and C-3PO. A New Hope grants these characters a status of full moral personhood, independent of their synthetic construction or programmed limitations. By attributing fear, loyalty, and agency to the droids, the narrative asserts that consciousness and the capacity for moral judgment, rather than biological origin, constitute the baseline for inclusion within the ethical community. When the human characters treat these mechanical beings with respect and companionship, they reinforce a worldview where technological life is a valid participant in the struggle for justice. The droids are not mere tools or props, they are essential moral agents whose commitment to their mission often mirrors or exceeds that of their organic counterparts. The tension between the individual and the system finds its most profound expression in the rejection of nihilism in favor of an active, defiant construction of meaning. The universe of the film is undeniably oppressive, dominated by the encroaching reach of the Empire and the cold, mechanical logic of the Death Star. In the face of such overwhelming power, the characters refuse to surrender to the absurd, opting instead to build a structure of resistance that affirms life against the background of totalizing control. Luke, Leia, and their allies do not wait for the universe to offer them purpose, they define their own morality through the act of rebellion. This is an articulation of purpose that thrives precisely because it is chosen, transforming the chaotic, dangerous vacuum of the galaxy into a space where individual action carries profound, reverberating weight. This moral calculus further differentiates the protagonists from the Empire through the distinction between the nature of their respective violence. While both sides employ lethal force, the film distinguishes between violence utilized as an extension of a destructive, exclusionary hierarchy and violence employed as a defensive necessity for the preservation of freedom. The Empire operates under a cold utilitarianism where the destruction of entire populations is a justifiable cost for the consolidation of order. In contrast, the Rebel Alliance's engagement in conflict is framed as a moral obligation to protect the capacity for human agency itself. The divergence lies in the intent. The Empire's actions are designed to collapse the world into a single, predictable narrative, whereas the actions of the protagonists are designed to defend the messy, unpredictable existence of multiple autonomous lives. Ultimately, the film posits that the suffering associated with truth is preferable to the deceptive comfort of ignorance. Characters who occupy the margins, such as those living under the boot of imperial oversight, are eventually confronted with the necessity of knowing the true nature of their reality. There is no moral path that allows for a return to the safety of domestic denial once the machinery of oppression is fully observed. To see the Death Star, both as a literal weapon and as a metaphorical system, is to accept the burden of intervention. The film argues that ethical maturity demands this painful transition from the comfort of the familiar to the struggle of the informed. By rejecting the choice of blissful unawareness, the characters solidify their status as architects of their own moral destiny, proving that the struggle for justice is not merely an external conflict, but an internal evolution of the self. Determinism, agency, and time. The narrative trajectory of Star Wars: A New Hope operates as an inquiry into the tension between predetermined cosmic architecture and the assertion of individual agency. While the galaxy is governed by the iron-fisted, structuralist machinery of the Empire, a system that treats citizens as interchangeable components of a singular, decaying bureaucratic apparatus, the film posits that human history is written by the capacity for spontaneous, ethical choice. Luke Skywalker's journey from a moisture farmer on the desolate fringes of Tatooine to a pilot within the rebellion serves as a rejection of the idea that one is merely a product of their material environment. His development demonstrates that the individual possesses the power to disrupt established systems, provided they embrace a moral imperative that transcends the cold, transactional logic of the status quo. This philosophical conflict manifests most clearly through the Force, an omnipresent energy field that acts as the ultimate arbiter of truth and connectivity. By its nature, the Force suggests a universe that is not accidental but inherently patterned. Characters like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader move through the story with a sense of temporal and moral clarity, operating as if they understand the currents of destiny. However, the film avoids succumbing to fatalism. Instead, the Force functions as an invitation to participate in a greater, meaningful order. Luke's decision to trust his instincts and deactivate his targeting computer during the final assault on the Death Star represents the film's central assertion of agency. He chooses to move beyond the constraints of technological reliance and logical calculation, instead aligning his internal volition with an intuitive awareness of the present moment. This choice validates the belief that while the universe may contain vast, overarching structures, the individual remains the essential catalyst for transformation. The Empire stands as the physical embodiment of a structuralist nightmare, representing a world where the individual is systematically erased. Its architecture, sterile, geometric, and relentlessly monochromatic, reflects a rigid devotion to order, control, and the suppression of the anomalous. Within the corridors of the Death Star, technology is not a tool for liberation but a means of standardizing existence and enforcing conformity. The film illustrates the inherent instability of such a system. By treating labor and life as fungible commodities, the Empire creates the very conditions that necessitate its own disruption. The rebellion is not merely an opposing political entity, it is a manifestation of the inherent desire for a life governed by something other than administrative decree. The victory at Yavin signifies that, even when faced with an overwhelming technological hegemony, the focused intent of the individual can shatter the gears of an oppressive machine. Furthermore, the film avoids the paralysis of existential dread by framing the burden of choice as a prerequisite for self-actualization. When Luke is confronted with the call to action, he moves from a state of conditioned, agrarian simplicity into a reality defined by responsibility. He is not forced by a pre-written script, he continuously opts into his role within the larger conflict. His arc acknowledges that life in a structured, indifferent universe requires the constant construction of meaning through action. The absence of a complete, objective certainty about the future does not render his struggle futile. Rather, the active engagement, the willingness to step into the cockpit and face the unknown, becomes the primary source of personal liberation. The final synthesis of the film reaffirms a sense of existential hope. As the medal ceremony brings the survivors together, the focus remains on the unity of those who chose to act against the inertia of systemic decay. The film concludes not with the promise of a permanent utopia, but with the assertion that the struggle itself holds merit. By prioritizing the internal conviction of the protagonist over the dictates of the prevailing power, the narrative asserts that human history is defined by the moments in which the individual asserts their will against the weight of the inevitable. The victory is not an end to the complexity of the galaxy, but a demonstration that agency exists within the gaps of the machine. Consequently, A New Hope stands as a testament to the idea that, regardless of the scale of the system or the crushing gravity of circumstance, the individual's choice to act according to their own moral compass remains the most potent force in the universe. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. In Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope, the cinematography functions as the primary architect of a galaxy defined by the friction between the sterile, mechanical order of the Empire and the lived-in, tactile reality of the rebellion. The film establishes a visual hierarchy that intuitively maps power dynamics onto the frame. Grand Moff Tarkin and Darth Vader are consistently placed in compositions defined by verticality and rigid geometry, with low-angle shots emphasizing their detachment and control over the vast, cold corridors of the Death Star. In contrast, the protagonists, Luke, Han, and Leia, often inhabit frames dominated by horizontal movement and cluttered environments. When Luke is introduced on Tatooine, his visual framing is defined by wide, expansive shots that emphasize his insignificance against the dual suns, grounding his narrative in a sense of yearning that transcends the cramped, rusted architecture of his uncle's moisture farm. The camera movement reinforces the distinction between an observant, objective reality and the subjective experience of the characters. While the Death Star sequences utilize smooth, precise tracking shots that mimic the clinical efficiency of the Imperial war machine, scenes on the Millennium Falcon or in the Mos Eisley Cantina favor a more kinetic, handheld aesthetic. This shift allows the audience to inhabit the frantic, improvised nature of the rebellion. The camera serves as a sentient witness to their struggle, moving with a grounded, human rhythm that mirrors the character's desperation. By utilizing these distinct movement languages, the film creates a somatic link between the viewer and the protagonists, ensuring that every transition from the claustrophobic hallways of a starship to the vastness of space feels like a tangible shift in agency and freedom. Color palette architecture further codifies the film's ideological conflict. The Empire is rendered in a spectrum of stark white, charcoal gray, and metallic blue, reflecting a world where the human element has been bleached away by technological dominance. This austerity is deliberately punctured when the action moves to organic environments like the desert of Tatooine or the rebel base on Yavin 4, which rely on warm, earthy tones of sand, rust, and vegetation. This color shift serves as a visual shorthand for the film's moral focus, the preservation of life and growth against the vacuum-sealed stagnation of authoritarian rule. The lighting serves the same purpose. Imperial spaces are lit with flat, shadowless overhead fixtures that emphasize uniformity, whereas intimate moments are defined by chiaroscuro. The light that spills across Luke's face as he stares at the binary sunset is soft and evocative, signaling a transition from the stagnant reality of his chores to the dawn of his personal awakening. Depth and negative space are masterfully deployed to dictate the psychological state of the characters. Characters trapped by the Empire are frequently framed against solid walls or within narrow, metallic apertures, using depth as a tool for incarceration. The Death Star's corridors are infinite yet entirely devoid of life, utilizing negative space to create a sense of existential dread that highlights the loneliness of the individual caught within the gears of an oppressive system. Conversely, the rebels are often framed within complex, deep-focus compositions that highlight their relationships with one another. Whether they are huddled over a hollow projector or scrambling through the Falcon's cockpit, the depth of the field reinforces their connectivity, making the group feel like a singular, living organism functioning in defiance of the machine. Ultimately, the craft of A New Hope lies in its ability to marry the technical artifice of visual effects with a coherent, intuitive spatial language. The camera does not merely record the action, it interprets the struggle between the mechanical and the organic through every tilt, pan, and color choice. By consistently aligning the visual framing, movement, and light with the underlying ideological themes of the story, the film constructs a world that feels physically immutable yet narratively fluid. The technical execution ensures that the audience understands the stakes not through exposition, but through the immediate, visceral sensation of being trapped in a corridor or soaring through an open, uncaring galaxy. Every frame functions as an argument for the necessity of human spirit within an increasingly synthetic reality, grounding the grand scale of the conflict in the immediate, observable truth of the image itself. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The visual language of Star Wars, A New Hope relies on the tactile synthesis of physical grit and precise, engineered illusion. By prioritizing practical effects, miniatures, and intricate optical compositing, the film grounds its fantastical elements in a tangible reality that respects Newtonian physics. The iconic space battles, realized through Dijkstraflex motion control photography, anchor the vast, sterile vacuum of space with the weight and kinetic behavior of actual aircraft. This technical approach imbues the film's VFX with a consistent materiality. When a TIE fighter suffers a hit, the resulting explosion interacts with the debris and light of its environment with an immediacy that feels grounded in real-world combustion. Because the film avoids the weightlessness often associated with later, purely digital environments, the Death Star's corridors and the desolate vistas of Tatooine maintain a cohesive sensory footprint that links the performer to the surrounding spectacle. The film's aesthetic strategy excels in the mastery of invisible VFX. The integration of matte paintings into live-action plates serves as the bridge between the human drama and the expansive, oppressive architecture of the Empire. These hand-painted, expansive horizons allow the film to portray a world of vast scale without sacrificing the depth or focus of the cinematography. The precision of the compositing ensures that the light falling on Luke Skywalker or Han Solo consistently matches the reflected luminance of the synthetic surroundings. This adherence to consistent black levels and color temperatures prevents the floating effect that often disrupts immersion, ensuring that the characters appear physically present within their digital and constructed environments. Even in the crowded Mos Eisley Cantina, the practical masks and animatronic puppets benefit from lighting design that emphasizes their physical texture and presence, avoiding the uncanny valley by remaining strictly within the realm of the tangible. The film's economic aesthetic, the visual language of a used universe, serves as a brilliant technical cover for its resource constraints. By presenting technology that is rusted, dented, and perpetually in a state of entropy, the production design excuses minor visual artifacts and imperfections in the early optical compositing. This choice allows the VFX to function as an extension of the narrative's themes regarding scarcity and decay. The scratches on a hull or the smudges on a viewport become part of the narrative texture, framing the technological wizardry as secondary to the story's lived-in atmosphere. Consequently, the reliance on high-contrast lighting and deep shadows, chiaroscuro techniques, not only aids in hiding the boundaries of composite shots but also reinforces the film's thematic focus on the moral and existential struggle between light and darkness. The sound design completes this illusion by acting as the primary carrier of momentum. The roar of engines, the hum of the Death Star's interior, and the distinctive whine of laser fire are not merely decorative but are essential components of the film's physical reality. The audio mix aligns with the visual rhythm of the editing, creating a sensory loop where every mechanical movement is accounted for by a specific sonic texture. By layering diegetic sounds that feel heavy and industrious, the film persuades the viewer of the mass and power of its artificial creations. The technical achievement of A New Hope lies in its ability to treat the synthetic as an extension of the real, creating a cohesive, immersive world where the camera, the lighting, and the mechanical effects work in concert to define a reality that feels entirely substantial. The film succeeds because it treats its craft as a servant to the environment. It builds a world that does not demand the viewer's belief, but instead constructs a physical space so coherent that belief becomes an involuntary response to the visual and auditory evidence on screen. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. Star Wars, Episode IV, A New Hope operates as a masterwork of sensory architecture, where the boundaries between diegetic sound, musical score, and visual rhythm coalesce to form a cohesive, tactile reality. The film establishes its environment not merely through visual world building, but through a dense, layered soundscape that treats technology as a living, breathing entity. The mechanical hum of the Death Star, the rhythmic pulse of hyperdrive engines, and the discordant, high-pitched whines of ship servos create a sonic environment that is overwhelmingly industrial. This clutter serves as a deliberate sensory counterpoint to the organic, flowing nature of the Force, effectively communicating the film's central friction, the collision between rigid, sterile technological dominance and the fluid, unseen power of the natural world. The score by John Williams frequently dissolves into the sound design, blurring the lines between orchestral composition and the ambient noise of the galaxy. By using recurring leitmotifs, the swelling horns of heroic arrival or the low-frequency, brass-heavy dread associated with imperial presence, the music functions as an emotional anchor that dictates the viewer's interpretation of scale. When the camera pans across the vast, metallic surface of the Death Star, the music assumes a predatory, rhythmic cadence that mimics the repetitive, clockwork nature of the facility. This integration ensures that the viewer experiences the Empire not just as a visual threat, but as a sonic one, an omnipresent force that dictates the pace and rhythm of life within the galactic core. Editing in A New Hope serves as a primary tool for psychological pacing, particularly during the transition from the arid isolation of Tatooine to the high-stakes navigation of space combat. The rhythm of the cuts is calculated to mirror the internal state of Luke Skywalker. Initial sequences are characterized by long, contemplative wide shots and steady, rhythmic transitions that reflect his stasis and yearning. As he is pulled into the conflict, the editing rhythm accelerates, mirroring his increasing sensory overload. During the trench run sequence, the film achieves a frantic, precise tempo where every cut is synced to the rapid-fire exchange of dialogue, blaster fire, and the proximity alerts of the X-Wing. This technical acceleration places the audience directly inside the cockpit, creating a sense of claustrophobia that is only broken when Luke finally chooses to disengage his targeting computer. The film makes brilliant, tactical use of silence as a narrative weapon. In the moment preceding the destruction of the Death Star, when Luke shuts off his targeting system, the sound design undergoes a sudden, radical shift. The chaotic cacophony of the battle, the sirens, the comms chatter, and the mechanical roar of the engines, drops away, leaving only the focused, singular tone of his own breath and the subtle, ethereal presence of the Force. By muting the external environment, the film forces the viewer into Luke's perspective, privileging his internal conviction over the objective data of his ship's computer. This erasure of background noise functions as an auditory manifestation of his character arc. He achieves clarity only when he abandons the noise of the system for the stillness of the self. Visual and auditory perspectives are consistently aligned to emphasize the vulnerability of the individual. In crowded spaces like the Mos Eisley Cantina, the sound mix is dense, overwhelming, and dissonant, reflecting the lack of hierarchy and the desperate, illicit nature of that society. Conversely, the corridors of the Death Star are defined by a sterile, rhythmic silence that feels unnervingly precise, highlighting the inhuman efficiency of the Imperial machine. The audio perspective consistently follows the protagonist, muffling the world when they are forced into moments of introspection and intensifying the mechanical dread when they are under threat. By manipulating the sensory input of the audience, A New Hope does not merely depict a conflict between rebellion and empire, it creates an immersive, physiological experience that compels the viewer to feel the weight, the pace, and the suffocating pressure of a galaxy on the brink of change. Through this meticulous orchestration of rhythm and sound, the film cements its legacy as a quintessential example of how technical craft can transform a spacebound myth into an intimate, visceral reality. Synthesis of craft. Star Wars Episode IV: A New Hope operates as a foundational masterclass in technical synthesis, where the specific choices in lens selection, photochemical texture, and frame choreography serve to manufacture a lived-in, tactile reality. By eschewing the antiseptic sheen typical of mid-century science fiction, the film utilizes cinematography to articulate the central tension between the decaying, organic frontier of the Outer Rim and the sterile, oppressive architecture of the Empire. The film relies heavily on anamorphic lens configurations that compress the visual field, lending a sense of weight and physical proximity to the characters. This choice of optics accomplishes two objectives: it keeps the human protagonists grounded within their cluttered, industrial environments and simultaneously allows the massive, looming scale of the Imperial machinery, most notably the Death Star, to dwarf the human frame. The choice of lens is not merely a tool for capture but a narrative device that forces the audience to reconcile the small, fractured ego of Luke Skywalker against the overwhelming, monolithic nature of the Imperial state. By keeping the background depth compressed, the camera effectively isolates characters within their own psychological confines, reinforcing their isolation as they navigate the transition from rural oblivion to galactic upheaval. The medium itself, captured on 35mm film, possesses a distinct, granular quality that grounds the fantastical elements in a tangible history. The presence of physical grain, the texture of the medium, is essential to the film's success. It acts as a bridge between the practical miniatures and the live-action performers, ensuring that the light hits the ships and the actors with a unified, photographic consistency. Because the film refuses to hide its medium, it invites the audience to perceive the universe not as a frictionless digital construct, but as a site of wear, tear, and historical accumulation. The scratches on the hull of the Millennium Falcon and the dust on the Tatooine dunes are rendered with a veracity that renders the impossible architecture of the space station credible. This commitment to physical presence extends to the choreography of the frame. In the sequences within the detention block or the trash compactor, the camera movement is often frantic and handheld, mimicking the visceral, claustrophobic reality of a combat zone. Conversely, the Imperial hallways are filmed with sweeping, controlled, and rhythmic dolly movements, suggesting a pre-programmed, machine-like order. The transition between these styles of movement maps the character's psychological state. They are forced to discard the chaotic, individualistic rhythms of their civilian lives to survive within the rigid, synthetic infrastructure of the Empire. The framing creates a visual language of entrapment, where the characters are frequently hemmed in by cold, vertical metallic lines, emphasizing that the state dictates the parameters of their movement. The use of chiaroscuro lighting acts as a profound metaphor for the film's exploration of the Jungian shadow. Within the Death Star, light is utilized not to illuminate, but to create high-contrast silhouettes. The presence of deep, impenetrable shadows does more than establish a mood, it renders the villain, Darth Vader, as a figure of absence. His black armor absorbs the light, while the harsh white surfaces of the Imperial corridors highlight the sterility of his domain. This lighting contrast physically manifests the conflict between the protagonist's potential for light and the encroaching darkness of the system he seeks to topple. When Vader moves through these spaces, he is often framed as an extension of the geometry itself, a living embodiment of the institution's cold, absolute power. The most technically significant shot, the climactic trench run, serves as the final synthesis of these elements. As the camera tracks the X-wings, the blend of practical motion control miniatures, anamorphic focus pulls, and the aggressive, non-diegetic pulse of the score creates a sequence that is as philosophically vital as it is technically accomplished. Here, the lens choices and the speed of the edit collapse the distance between the pilot and the target, mirroring the protagonist's final internal alignment. The moment of impact, where the technical precision of the VFX meets the human emotional arc, proves that the film's magic is a deliberate act of engineering. The craft does not exist to distract from the narrative but to act as the primary vessel for it, proving that in a world of oppressive systems, the synthesis of human intent and precise technical execution is the only force capable of disrupting the status quo. The visual fidelity of the final explosion is not merely a spectacle, it is the ultimate affirmation of the individual's capacity to penetrate the impenetrable, marking the triumph of organic spirit over the calculated geometry of total control. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Star Wars: A New Hope functions as a foundational myth that synthesizes the anxieties of post-Vietnam American society into a resonant, coherent vision of individual transcendence. While the film is often viewed through the lens of pure escapism or simple morality, its true impact lies in its sophisticated marriage of high-concept visual storytelling with a deeply human inquiry into the relationship between agency and history. The film operates as a restorative narrative, one that replaces the cynical, fragmented reality of the 1970s with a world where conviction, when harnessed through a connection to something larger than the self, can dismantle even the most entrenched systemic evils. The world of A New Hope is defined by a rigid stratification of technological and economic power. The Empire represents the ultimate expression of rationalist, industrial control, where the universe is reduced to a series of calculations, resource extractions, and authoritarian enforcement. This system is physically manifested in the Death Star, a hyper-engineered construct that serves as the visual and existential baseline for the film's conflict. Against this, the Rebel Alliance represents a fragile, decentralized response, relying on scavenged hardware and individual intuition. This technical disparity highlights the film's central philosophical stance, that material superiority is secondary to the epistemic alignment of the individual with the metaphysical nature of the Force. The characters are not merely fighting for a political cause, they are attempting to restore a lost, holistic understanding of existence that the Empire seeks to suppress through its sterile, bureaucratic machine. Luke Skywalker's journey is an exploration of the epistemic fracture that occurs when a personal, fabricated ego meets the crushing truth of a larger, often violent, history. Raised in the rural isolation of Tatooine, Luke's initial desire to escape his circumstances is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of his own origins and the nature of the wider galaxy. His transformation begins when he moves from the passive consumption of data, the maps and records provided by the droids, to the active, embodied experience of the Force. The training sequence on the Millennium Falcon, where Obi-Wan Kenobi forces Luke to block his sensory inputs to access a deeper awareness, is the emotional fulcrum of the film. It serves as a rejection of the purely materialist worldview imposed by the Empire, positing that true knowledge is derived from internal presence rather than external observation. The film's technical craft functions as an extension of this philosophical arc. The practical effects, ranging from the tactile, rusted aesthetic of the Tatooine landscape to the sleek, claustrophobic geometry of the Imperial corridors, create a sensory environment that grounds the metaphysical in the physical. The cinematography captures the vastness of the universe to emphasize the individual's role within it, particularly during the final trench run. By utilizing tight, rhythmic editing and a swelling, thematic score, the final sequence transcends a standard action beat to become a meditation on the synchronization of human intent with the environment. The camera does not merely track the movement of ships, it maps the transition of Luke from a doubting apprentice into an agent of cosmic necessity. His ultimate shot, taken with the targeting computer switched off, is the definitive assertion of his agency against the technological determinism of the Empire. The legacy of A New Hope is secured by this synthesis of the technical and the spiritual. It transformed the medium of cinema by demonstrating that complex, world-spanning concepts could be delivered through character-driven, archetypal stakes. The film concludes with a moment of profound catharsis, yet it remains anchored in the ongoing nature of the struggle. The final image of the medal ceremony mirrors the rigid, parade-like formations of the imperial hierarchy, acknowledging that while a battle has been won, the underlying tension between the individual and the state remains unresolved. This gap, the silent acknowledgement that the victory is not the end of the war, is the source of the film's enduring power. It invites the audience to recognize the existence of their own force, a capacity for principled action that exists independently of the structures of control. Ultimately, A New Hope is a call to awaken from the passive acceptance of one's circumstances. It asserts that to act within the world is to risk total disruption, and that such disruption is not only necessary but a natural byproduct of personal authenticity. The film does not merely present a fantasy, it offers a blueprint for navigating the dissonance of a world defined by overwhelming, seemingly impenetrable systems. By placing the fate of the galaxy in the hands of a moisture farmer who chooses to look beyond the horizon, the film provides a permanent, luminous argument for the efficacy of the human spirit in the face of absolute, cold calculation. The final shot of the triumphant rebels is not just a conclusion, it is a point of departure, suggesting that the most meaningful work of existence is the constant effort to remain in alignment with the light, even when the shadow of the machine looms large.